And it's our Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Thursday. It is time for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have anything to say about the stories discussed in this show. True Crime Talk Radio is a segment where I can talk about multiple true crime stories within a single episode. And because today is Thursday, you guys can say, ooh, something's hot in that cup. Say hello to Starry here, Starbucks on the cheap. I'm joking. This isn't actually hot. I don't drink hot tea or hot coffee. I drink cold tea and cold coffee. And Mike Half Moon Mullins is here saying hello, everyone. And Classic Chevy Cat says hi all. Good morning to you guys. Welcome to True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. So, this is going to be a different type of episode because, as you can see, the title of it is The Crimes of Addiction. And there are a couple different reasons why I wanted to do this one. And on True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, I often begin the episodes with something called the Crime Talk Points. But instead, I wanted to use something different to start this episode because last year I became somewhat of a regular reader and listener to True Crime News. True Crime News has a very popular YouTube channel out there, but I was mostly listening to the podcast that is available at truecrimenews.com. And I just decided to check the headlines today the way that I used to in the morning. One thing about me is I just try to ingest as much true crime content as possible. Been doing it for a couple years now. No turning back. And on Black Box Online Radio, this channel here, I frequently talk about serial killers, the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper. Of course, I talk about other stories such as D.B. Cooper, but I do a lot of serial killer episodes even here on True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. So, there's a big difference between the way that serial killers operate and the way that other aspects of the true crime world operates. For example, I just pulled up the headlines from True Crime News. Search underway for a man who allegedly killed his neighbor and removed his ankle monitor. Then he went on the run. The next story, 80-year-old man allegedly fatally shot an 11-year-old neighbor and then admitted to killing his wife. The next story, Kentucky man accused of fatally stabbing his 81-year-old neighbor. And the next story, man who beat and fatally stabbed and shot a sleeping neighbor is now sentenced. Next story, Hawaiian man allegedly stabbed his elderly neighbor to death. Next story. Florida woman sentenced for killing her neighbor through door amid dispute with her kids. Do you see how this is just going on and on and on? This is what the majority of true crime cases that relate to murder appear to be. This is what the majority of homicides appear to be. Not stories of serial killers, not intricate mysteries like the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper. No, it's disputes that are happening between people who are in close proximity and one person goes over the edge. And that's bad, absolutely. But I've really found that there are other aspects of the true crime world that can be explored. And that's why I wanted to do this episode on the crimes of addiction. And another thing that I do on True Crime Talk Radio in the morning is often I share some things from Radio Reddit. And right now I would like to just go through the most basic points, and it's going to tie into the crimes of addiction very quickly. Firstly, we have Casbah here saying good morning to you all. Good morning, Casbah, and Dave Smith. Sup, everyone. Sup, Ned. Sup to you too, Dave. Cheers from Starry. So, on Radio Reddit, somebody asked a question. How can people pinpoint the specific look of a sexual predator? It's almost like a challenge question. How can you pinpoint that look? How can you determine if someone is a sexual predator just by looking at them? And a former police officer responded by saying, you can't. There are so many predators out there that look ordinary, that are non-threatening, that are elusive, where you would never suspect this person. Yet, there is this trope out there. There's this widely held belief that certain offenders all look alike. And the explanation that was provided by this officer was that it relates to a lack of confidence and poor social skills. And I'm just listening to a program like, wow, That's a really interesting response. And this is one of the reasons why I listen to people who are in firsthand situations, who have firsthand connections to the material. I'm not a member of law enforcement myself, but I can hear and take in the comments that are made by members of law enforcement. What are they sharing? And you can compare and contrast these different types of thought processes. Lack of confidence and social skills. That's what makes somebody look like a sex offender. Something to keep in mind. Now to move to the title story for today's episode. Another radio Reddit point. Some people, multiple people shared the story of an addiction, and not an addiction to drugs, but there are different types of addictions out there, such as gambling, a gambling addiction. And multiple people shared the story of how somebody wanted to steal money from a business, go to a casino, try to double the money, and then return it to the company safe and keep the profits for themselves. And they failed miserably. One person was working as the manager of a fast food restaurant. Another one was working for an apartment complex. They took the money out of the safe. They thought they were going to get rich and return it, and nobody would know. But the issue with that is, have they not heard the expression, the house always wins? How on earth can you just walk into a casino expecting that you're going to double your money? That is the worst business plan that I have ever heard. But gambling is attractive to many people for many different reasons. A lot of people are going after the quick buck. To tie into this subject, though, the real reason why I wanted to do this episode is because I saw a post that was made available on the channel Charles Perallo. He is a rather popular YouTuber that I know almost nothing about. I've just seen 2 episodes from his channel, and they were both shorts. And they were discussing the concept of addiction. Well, the shorts weren't. He posts a lot on YouTube, polls, challenge questions, and he posted one challenge question about the concept of addiction, and it led up by telling his own personal story. And he's saying that his father was somebody who succumbed to an addiction. He lost his father to a drug addiction, and it was pills. His father was an educated person. He was a medical doctor, but he had this type of infatuation with narcotics, and he would combine them with energy drinks. He also had an energy drink addiction. Some people might debate the validity of that addiction, but no matter what happened, no matter what type of rehab or detox or whatever method he was using to get off of the drugs, he would always go back. And his son, Charles, who was posting this on YouTube, was saying he just couldn't get over the hurdle of thinking that the drugs were cool. And I'm just like, oh my goodness, this is it. This is it. That's an idea that I've understood for so long, but I haven't been able to put into words. And ultimately, I think that that's just hitting the nail on the head, because people who are involved with drug addictions don't necessarily think that they're cool. Maybe sometimes yes, sometimes no, but not typically. I mean, all of these things that people are saying, on the show Intervention, or listening to psychologists, or just hearing the words out of the addict's mouth, they're not saying that they're cool. They're dealing with things like self-esteem issues. They're dealing with things like being the victims of abuse. They're dealing with things like their own internal problems. And they are doing what I call importing the destructive behaviors. And that doesn't mean that they're cool. They think the drugs are cool. That was a very interesting breakdown. Now to the next point. This is also something that I think is rarely talked about, but it's just an observation that I began to notice that was shared just from people in conversations, where I could even ask this to you guys in the chat, everyone who's listening to this program right now. What do you think about this? Some people get hooked on drugs and alcohol and harmful substances, maybe even gambling, because they think of it as being strong. And there was one particular video that I was watching that was not from Radio Reddit, but from a similar channel, where it's sharing the stories of drug users on Reddit. And they said it divides into 2 concepts. One camp is just like, hey, I don't know who you are, but you need to get help. You need to go to rehab like right now. And then the other side is like, You got to do harder stuff. You're a pussy. Oh, you do cocaine? You're a pussy. You need to do meth. There's this other side where just people think that using drugs is strong and it makes them strong and it makes them appear strong. Not cool, not necessarily. Maybe trying to smoke something in high school in front of the popular kids to show off that you can. That could even be tying into it. But that's still that person who's smoking this stuff doesn't think that they're cool yet. They're doing this to gain acceptance by using the drugs which they think are cool. And but this is not about being cool. This is about trying to feel like someone is strong. And it's just something that I haven't particularly heard, but I was just so surprised that there were so many people out there who were pushing this narrative on how you need to do harder drugs, otherwise you're a pussy. Their words, not mine. And if anybody has any stories of crimes of addiction that they want to share in the live chat, please feel free to do so. You can also put anything in the live chat. Anything true crime related can be discussed on this program. And because this is True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, I also wanted to share something else that I encountered. This was a story that I talked about very briefly in 2024. And it's the case of Susan Wright, who was the blue-eyed butcher. And she is somebody who was dealing with a very intense case of abuse. And I just want to look at something that was posted earlier because I want to read this whole thing for you. And it is from Real True Crime. And it says, on January 13th of 2003, 26-year-old Susan Wright tied her husband Jeff to the bed, climbed on top of him, and fatally stabbed him 193 times. 41 wounds to Jeff's face, 46 to his chest, and 7 to his groin. And Susan had stabbed her husband so violently that the tip of the knife broke off and was lodged in his skull, and she used multiple knives. Susan later claimed that she killed Jeff in self-defense. She also said that he had abused her throughout the marriage, often kicking, slapping, and punching her. And when Jeff allegedly turned his anger toward their 4-year-old son, that fateful January night, Susan said she snapped. And this is the story of the murder of Jeff Wright, committed by Susan Wright. They also made a movie about this called Blue-Eyed Butcher. And I did a story, just a short episode about it last year when she was released from prison. And I just thought it was very interesting about how people were responding to this type of response, because everybody agrees she was a victim of abuse. All of these stories of abuse that went on for years are true. Beatings, slappings, threats, abusing the children too, controlling her life. Nobody disputes that. What they do seem to have a problem with, though, is the way that she responded. After the murder of Jeff Wright, she took his body and buried him in the backyard. And this is the first comment that came in on the post. If he hurt their son, good job. And a lot of people took exception to that, because I'm really surprised that this came out this way, because I will never forget this comment that came from longtime BBOR follower Batman66 when he said, stabbed 193 times? That was no accident, Dr. Watson. What they're trying to say is, yes, she's the victim. Yes, he did bad things to her. But she had so many other alternatives. Leaving the marriage, finding somewhere safe to go, separations, divorce. Now, maybe she was terrified. Maybe she was traumatized. But the way she went about it still seems somewhat unacceptable. One detail about the story of Susan Wright is that after she murdered Jeff Wright, she called his family saying, "Oh, he's being abusive toward me. I'm going to get away for a while." And they said, "You can come stay with us." Not her family, not her side of the family, his. And it's like, I don't know what she would have been thinking after she murdered him and buried him in the backyard. That must have just been a shocker. That was the way out. Go stay with his in-laws till the situation calms down, talk it over, then decide that you want a divorce or something like that. And even if problems persist, there are ways to get away that are even more intense than that. You can find other people that will help you. What's quite possible that happened with Susan Wright in the case of the Blue-Eyed Butcher murder is that even though she was a victim, she still could have used these alternatives. What she decided to do was she perhaps launched a revenge plan, a cold and calculating revenge plan where she wanted to murder her husband. And, being stabbing someone 193 times, it seems like this was a premeditated rage killing where someone had a lot of pent up rage inside her, pent up anger, and she thought, he's done very bad things to me, so I'm going to murder him. And then I'm going to try and bury the body in the backyard, try to get away with this. But ultimately, she was caught and convicted. Now we have a comment here on the post that says, I believe her, honestly. From what I've heard, it takes a lot of effort and stamina to stab someone repeatedly. A woman protecting her child has known to have increased strength and stamina. If she stabbed him 193 times, she had to have been in her mama bear mode. Oh, wait a second. I don't necessarily agree with that, because when I first learned about the story of Susan Wright, it was because it was mentioned in the news about how she was the woman who stabbed her husband dozens of times. Then she took her child and put them to bed at night. Okay, go to sleep. And then she went back and stabbed him again dozens of times. So this goes to show that there's a type of retaliation, overkill, very strong. Yala Yolo is here, says, hello, Ned. Hello, Yala Yolo. And the next one here is, I remember my mother being horrified when I said that if somebody was hurting my kids, I'd be prepared to go to jail for killing them. In defense, sure. So many people talk about that. I would not say that there's anything monstrous for wanting to protect your own children to the nth degree. But that doesn't appear to be what's happening here. This appears to be the story of somebody who wanted to get out of the marriage and to leave as much destruction on her husband as possible, to bring as much destruction to him. This was about revenge, punishment, and something that she felt that she deserved, which is a terrible shame. I definitely believe that this was a result of the years of abuse, but that also doesn't justify these types of actions. Next comment, damn abusers. I can totally understand her snapping. I can too. But just because you understand what someone was feeling, and maybe I don't understand all of the emotions, I can comprehend it from an outsider perspective. But just because you understand that, it doesn't mean she can get away with it in a court of law. Next comment, for that level of rage, you gotta have snapped, and it's rare for a woman to have that level of physical aggression, but triggering the mama bear is one of the few ways. I tend to disagree with that, because what I have found after looking into true crime cases for years and years and years is that women can do very vicious things. You guys know all about this. There was even a show about this called Snapped, Women Who Kill. And this type of response can definitely happen. I mean, there are serial killers out there like Eileen Wuornos. There are also serial killers out there who result to things like poisoning. But if you specifically want to talk about physical force, there was one study that was put out that talked about how women use the same amount of physical force as men, if not more, when they believe they will not be threatened. When they believe that there is not a physical threat to them, men and women would be the same in that regards. Men would also retaliate if they do believe that they are not threatened. So that's what I tend to stand with. Mr. Flack Nasty's here saying, what's up, Ned? Yo, what's up, Mr. Flack Nasty? Cheers from Starry. And then the next comment, she needs to be locked up forever. I don't care what the circumstances, because if a man would have done this, then he would not have been treated in the same way, and he would have been given the maximum sentence. Most likely. But with a man, men deal with some very intense domestic violence issues. I completely agree that if a man was the victim of physical violence from his wife, then he would be treated differently. There would even be this stigma about reaching out. People would be criticizing him for reaching out, and they would just be like, why on earth are you even calling the cops when your wife is hitting you? Just deal with it yourself. So mostly I agree with that, but still, he would be given a much harsher sentence if he murdered her. Next comment. Years of abuse could make someone stab someone that many times. It's self-defense at the start, but as she continued with the resentment, it became a crime of passion. But the fact that she chose to bury him in the backyard suggests to me that maybe she had this planned all along. Men often think they can abuse women and nothing will happen, but all actions have consequences. And to any man who abuses his wife, no, just no, you are in the wrong. Next one. I hate to say it, but if I get it. If he really abused her that badly and then turned his abuse onto the son, I can understand her snapping. And this is why I wanted to read this off to you guys, because so many people were on the side of the killer in this situation. And I also began to notice that there was this type of similarity that I began to think about with Gypsy Rose Blanchard, because both of these women, Susan Wright and Gypsy Rose Blanchard, were the victims of very intense abuse. And with Gypsy Rose Blanchard, she orchestrated the murder of her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard. And it was an instance where a lot of people took the side of the murderer in this one. And Gypsy Rose didn't commit the murder herself. She met a guy on the internet named Nick Godejohn, and she convinced him to commit the murder, and they were going to run off together, which they did for a very short period of time. You guys know the story of Gypsy Rose. She was raised as a victim of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Her mother was forcing her to live with certain conditions that she didn't actually have. She told her that she had cancer, muscular dystrophy, and confined her to a wheelchair. But she was not actually suffering from those conditions. She also underwent numerous surgeries and even had a feeding tube inserted, even though she didn't need it. So with this story, this appears to be one that where somebody did snap. Everybody understood that Gypsy Rose Blanchard was dealing with a type of post-traumatic stress, a type of mental breakdown, that she must have been damaged to the point where she felt that this was her only way out. And also, to provide details, Gypsy Rose Blanchard did try to leave and run away, but she was unable to do so. Her mother always manipulated her into coming back. A big difference is Gypsy Rose Blanchard had experienced all of this stuff throughout the entirety of her life, whereas Susan Wright only experienced this in adulthood. And also, as somebody who just grew up and didn't have any in-laws to turn to, and except not counting Nick Godejohn's parents, she had fewer resources. It still doesn't justify the murder, but people were definitely more sympathetic toward Gypsy Rose Blanchard. And actually, I would like to turn to some things here in the chat, because we have Classic Chevy Cat who says something about the crimes of addiction. I was married to an addict. First booze, then pills. I can't remember why the booze, but he started popping pain pills because of pain, and he died because of the drugs. Sad story. Oh my goodness, Classic Chevy Cat. I am so sorry to hear about that. And this is also something, though, about the crimes of addiction definitely do escalate. And that's why I was so shocked to see all of these people on Reddit just saying, oh, what? You're doing pills? Well, you need to do meth, you weakling. People are encouraging other individuals to start harder drugs. And they think that these types of escalations in the importing of destructive behaviors is a good thing, or it's a strong thing, right? It's not even trying to be cool at that point. They're just trying to prove that they're strong. And then people get pulled into the world of addiction. And when I would watch the show Intervention, so many people would talk about this. So many of the people who are suffering from addictions would talk about this when they would say they hate their life. They hate the addiction. They don't like what it's doing to them. They know that it's killing them. The party is long over. They just can't get out. They just can't get out because of the toll that it takes on their body to get out. And also, some people really get stuck in these thought processes where the brain does whatever is familiar. The brain does whatever you are recreating. It recreates cycles of behaviors. And even though somebody is living day to day thinking that they're in a miserable situation, it was because I would watch Intervention and I would just be thinking, okay, all of these people are saying, I hate my life. I don't want to live like this anymore. And I'm like, well, what steps are you taking to get out of it? And they're not. Of course not. That's why there's a show. That's why they have to go through the intervention. That's why the addiction is happening, because they just feel that they are so trapped in that cycle of behaviors that they cannot get out of it. Earlier, I watched an episode of the show Cops, purely for nostalgia. I told you guys that I grew up with Cops and America's Most Wanted. That's how I spent my Saturday nights, and that's how I first learned about the Zodiac Killer. And on this episode of Cops, they were talking about, the crimes of addiction, as well as other related crimes such as prostitution. And one police officer said, sometimes I feel sorry for them, the people who are living these lifestyles. Sometimes I feel sorry for them. But then at other times, I realize how much crime is being committed because of things like drugs and prostitution and the toll that it takes on society. And you just cannot be on their side. So I think that that just relates to the entire understanding of criminology and just how criminology is the understanding of human behavior and its relation to the law. But of course, criminology would be defined as the study of crime. And Richard Delaney is here saying, oh no, I missed 23 minutes. Hey, it's all good, Richard Delaney. You still got a cheers from Starry. Starbucks on the cheap. Richard Delaney, you can put anything you want in the comment section. And one thing that I would also like to do is, and perhaps I'm going to be doing more of these in the future, is that I am going to start incorporating more comments from Zodiac Monday into these live streams because I know that almost everyone here follows the Zodiac Monday episodes. And there are going to be a couple big Zodiac Mondays coming out. So if you have not subscribed to Black Box Online Radio yet and you're curious about unsolved mysteries, I invite you to do so. And of course, Wednesday I talk about Jack the Ripper and D.B. Cooper on Fridays. Classic Chevy Cat says, a lot of people accidental overdose or deliberately. Like my ex, it does take a toll on the family, friends, and the community. So, I mean, I think that that's just absolutely true. Though, once again, I am very sorry for your loss, Classic Chevy Cat. But I mean, I'm also thinking about just using the Thursday show as kind of a Q&A session. For a very long time on Black Box Online Radio, I did the AMAs, which was the Ask Me Anythings, where I can respond to any of your comments. And I might do some more of those on the Thursday show, whereas the Tuesday episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, where you guys can chill with Snoopy, then you can always just have that one for any subject. Okay, first stuff about the Zodiac Killer. Silver Stuff responds to a challenge question that I had by saying that she believes that the Zodiac Killer was around age 35 and to his 40s. I have said that many times. You guys know that. You know what I think about that the Zodiac could have been age 35 to early 40s. However, this is going to be just an ounce of devil's advocate, which I know is really annoying, but to say it anyway, just an ounce of devil's advocate. There are lots of times when a serial killer starts operating between the ages of 16 and 25. They commit the first crime between the ages of 16 and 25, particularly 20 to 25. And this relates to testosterone, mental instability, and dysfunctional behavior, deviant behavior. So a Zodiac from age 20 to 25 is not out of the question. And Quentin Broom says, the Zodiac was too smart to be less than 25 years old, unless a whiz kid like Mac. I would guess mid-30s. Mac refers to William McDuff Andrew, the suspect of Mike Morford, and I'm not exactly convinced that Mac was a whiz kid. Mac was smart. This is one thing that Mike Morford wanted to convey to me, and that is William McDuff Andrew was a smart guy. He went through 6 years of college, graduated with a bachelor's degree in sociology from Chico State University, had a very long and stable career with the state of California, but mostly working for the Department of Corrections. Maybe he worked for the Department of Corrections the entire time. I'm hazy on that detail. But why would you say that the Zodiac was too smart to be someone under the age of 25? Because a lot of the things that the Zodiac Killer is talking about would be stuff that's talked about in high schools. Like, everybody freaks out over the fact that the Zodiac used the word radians in his letters. Well, radians are taught in high school trigonometry classes. People have brought that to my attention many times. Also, being familiar with stuff like the Mikado and Gilbert and Sullivan, someone who's under the age of 25 can be familiar with the Mikado and Gilbert Sullivan and comic books. The Zodiac made comic book references. Those could also be something that would indicate a younger Zodiac. And I'm playing the opposite side of the coin now. I'm mostly on your guys' side with that one. But we have something here from BJ Martin. who says, if we study serial killers, then maybe we could prevent another person from doing another murder. Is Brian Koberger guilty? I would not want to see him executed again. He should be studied to maybe prevent another murder. Two wrongs don't make a right. With Brian Koberger, and I talked about him on the last Zodiac Monday, that's why this is in here. There was this news story that came out that Brian Koberger may have committed the Idaho quadruple homicide in 2022 as a way to impress a professor named Catherine Ramsland. And she is the author of 59 books. I don't know how she found the time to do that, but he may have been trying to impress her by committing the perfect murder. I don't know if there's any evidence to support that. As soon as that news story came out, it was almost completely retracted. However, the second half of that statement could be true. Brian Koberger could have been trying to commit the perfect murder. I've even made comparisons between Brian Koberger and Leopold and Loeb. It would have been the perfect murder if they hadn't dropped a pair of glasses. It would have been the perfect murder if he hadn't dropped a knife sheath. Sure, study them. Criminology, study of crime. Bring it on. So Nice has a comment about the Zodiac killer's age, saying early 20s to 35 due to the witnesses. I also think he had a very high IQ. Amazing statement here, So Nice. Brian Hartnell estimated that the voice at Lake Berryessa could be from a person aged 20 to 30, much lower than age 40. I think the Zodiac had a high IQ as well. And I mean, we're talking about something like 115, 120, 130, 135. I don't think that he had an IQ of like 160, though. And the next one is, I think the Zodiac has been dead from the early 1970s, but I feel no later than 1978. All right, we have a 1978 Zodiac letter, which some people think is authentic. I'm not convinced of that at all, that the 1978 letter is authentic. In fact, if you were to ask me right now, I would say it's not. Why 1978? Why that specific year? Is it not possible for a serial killer to go on and fade into obscurity? Even a taunting serial killer like the Zodiac. Why does he have to keep getting people's attention? This was a phase in his life, and he moved on. Option number 2, we have Zodiac letters that go well beyond 1978 if you're going to entertain the unconfirmed communications. How about the 1981 letter, the 1982 Santa Claus card, the 86 letter, the 87 letter, the 1990 Eureka card, the 2001 card? You thought I was dead? No way. That's written on the 2001 card. So it's not really apparent to me that the Zodiac passed away in 1978. That specific year, of course, some people think that the Zodiac committed suicide in 1974 because in the 1974 Exorcist letter, it says he plunged himself into the billowy wave and an echo arose from the suicide's grave. They think that that means he's trying to commit suicide. And I'm just like, that's an inference. That's a possibility. Do we know that with certainty? No. He could just be quoting the Mikado, once again, Gilbert and Sullivan. Richard Delaney says, Ned, I like pondering ideas like the one you expressed about someone being alive that truly knows the identity of the Zodiac. Oh, was that from John Douglas or from Joe Kennedy? One of those two gentlemen who made the statement that the killer always tells someone, or it might have even been from Scott Reich on Crime Talk when he's like, nobody can keep a secret. Somebody will always tell someone. And that would mean that perhaps the Zodiac could have a family member who knew that he was the killer. Maybe he has a close friend who knew that he was the killer. Maybe somebody figured it out and he blackmailed them into silence. It could be. Classic Chevy Cat says, I'm in the camp that the Zodiac died in the 70s. Gut feeling means nothing. Sure, gut feelings. And that's fine. You don't express this stuff. I mean, share these experiences. And when I'm conducting the interviews on Black Box Online Radio that I do with true crime researchers, a lot of what they say comes down to gut feelings. Yes, they have interpretations of the evidence, but it's also just based on their personal feelings. Thanks, Starry. Okay, so we have our next comment here. Is there not a way to go to survivors if they are still alive and use modern ways to create a picture? Well, that would be like talking to Brian Hartnell and Mike Mageau and seeing if they can provide any additional information to make some sort of futurized composite sketch, AI composites. I don't think so. Because That would mean that they would still have to remember the details correctly. Only a handful of years after the D.B. Cooper case, the flight attendants like Tina Mucklow and Florence Schaffner were just saying that, stop asking me, stop showing me sketches, I can't remember what he looked like. 50 years plus. 50 plus years later, I don't think they can remember those things. And we have a comment about the upcoming book, actually, the book that is out now by Michael Butterfield, which is called The Zodiac Killer, The Story of America's Most Elusive Murderer. I hope I got that right. And it says, this is from John Bowman. The misspellings in the Butterfield book show a lack of professionalism. He gets the facts wrong related to the military service of Arthur Lee Allen and Paul Doer. He shares his opinions as if they're facts and engages in a bit of rhetorical hyperbole. All in all, this was a horrible book, and that's probably why the price was dropped to 99 cents. Well, I mean, I don't know if Michael Butterfield has any control over dropping something to 99 cents for his book. And, Planet X Film Works is here. Good morning, Ross. Cheers from Starry. I don't think Kindle prices are determined like that, especially when it's done through a publishing company. Now, the next comment is from Mike Cook that says, you guys cannot see the forest from the trees. Ignore the murders. They are totally unrelated. The real perpetrator, whoever wrote the letters and the concocted ciphers. There is no Zodiac outside of the letters. He is a clever invention of the letters, and an invention of a talented writer, or writers plural, who were able to manipulate the entire population of San Francisco to believe what they read in the papers. It was a brilliant scam. I've interacted with Mike Cook before, specifically on the Black Box Online Radio Facebook page, and he is clearly supporting what's called the Zodiac hoax theory. And it was something that I was very curious about in the past. However, I just think that all of the evidence suggests a single perpetrator now. The one issue that I do take with this is I go back and forth on this all the time. Maybe Ross can even relate to this to a certain extent, where even if it's not the theory that I would endorse, I still get curious about it. And it would be, could Lake Berryessa be a copycat? And I know that it's because I've been watching stuff about copycat killers on Facebook and such, and on YouTube too, and anywhere you get your videos. And when they talk about how, okay, this is how a copycat killer is going to operate, they're going to commit the crime in a similar way, but they're also going to change things to make it their own. And when you look at something like the Zodiac Killer's Lake Berryessa stabbing, yeah, it's definitely a Zodiac crime, but so many things have been changed. And you also have the height discrepancies. You have the crime committed by knife, tying up the victims, message on the car door. Yeah, that's very similar handwriting on the car door. And this person definitely wanted you to think that it was the Zodiac. This person also made a phone call after the Lake Berryessa stabbing the way that the Zodiac did after the Blue Rock Springs shooting. There's a lot of evidence for a single perpetrator. Drew Blahnik is here, who says, yes, if I were a victim, I probably wouldn't talk about the case for 50 years. Meaning that 50 years have gone by, you wouldn't want to talk about the case, especially people like Brian Hartnell and Mike Mageau. Brian Hartnell was stabbed multiple times. Mike Mageau was shot multiple times, including in the face. Terrible, terrible experiences. And people are just trying to extract information out of them. And they've probably done this for so long that even 56 years later, they are probably just ready to move on from this stuff, and they don't want to look back. However, how do you really solve the Zodiac Killer case? We talk about the DNA, we talk about the fingerprints, we talk about the palm prints, but those things aren't perfect. Our next comment comes from Jay. This is one that I might incorporate into the next Zodiac Monday. I think you have to stretch your imagination to see that there are too many differences between the Ray Davis and Paul Stein killings. To have two murders this much alike, you'd have to plan them that way. You know, it's really interesting that Jay would say that, because prior to last week's Zodiac Monday, I said that there was about a 7 out of 10 chance that Ray Davis was killed by the Zodiac. And we're talking about 70% chance. Now I would up that to maybe a 75% chance. After, looking more into the murder of Ray Davis, I was like, this begins to look a little bit more like a Zodiac crime. So, oh yes, completely very strong similarities. Taxi driver murdered, but robbery was not the primary motive, leaving some type of weird signature behind, whether it's dumping or the body or mailing in a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt, taunting phone calls, the way that the Zodiac made taunting phone calls. And Ross is here. He would know this stuff about the full circle theory better than anyone. And Ross actually has a question. Could Lake Herman Road be a random killer? Well, if your suspect is Frank Ryman Valentine, it would be, because he was incarcerated in Deer Lodge Prison at the time and gets out in the winter of 1969. So after Lake Herman Road, and that's just the theory that it was a copycat. I looked into that angle for a long time, Ross. I definitely was entertaining the possibility that Lake Herman Road was not exactly a copycat. Of course, it's not a copycat. The Zodiac hadn't been announced yet. It would have been a drug-related murder, and the Zodiac had obtained the information about the Lake Herman Road murders, then commits the Blue Rock Springs shooting, Lake Berryessa, and the Stein murder. Again, this can all be explained by a single perpetrator. Classic Chevy Cat says, how can it be a hoax as the letter included a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt? No reasonable explanation has been given for that. Well, you see, Classic Chevy Cat, Thomas Warren, author of the hoax theory, claims that somebody stole a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt from the crime lab. And this is what Tom Voigt just brings the hammer down on over and over again. And Tom Voigt says he claims that the crime lab was not locked and anybody could have broken in. For a while, he accused Robert Graysmith of stealing the shirt. For a while, he accused Paul Avery of stealing the shirt. For a while, he accused Armin Pellicetti of stealing the piece of the shirt and giving it to Hal Snook to mail in with letters. I think the crime lab was locked if I had to make a determination. Oh, and Ross says 85% on Ray Davis. Well, I went up from 70 to 75%. And Ross might think this is a little bit weird, but with the Domingos Edwards murders, that's the highest unconfirmed crime that I think could be Zodiac. And I give it the very odd rating of 79% out of 100, just under 80. But yes, Ray Davis and Domingos Edwards, very, very likely. And we have Batman66 here with a super chat. Batman66, good morning. Welcome to the show. Always nice to see you. I appreciate the super chat. Cheers from Starry. Starbucks on the cheap. And yes, Batman66, we have been going through the comments from the last week's Zodiac Monday, and I'm perhaps going to be doing a little bit more of this here on the Thursday episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, kind of like the old AMA fashion. And Batman66 left a comment on the most recent Zodiac Monday that says, Ned, could you try and interview Sphere the Cube? I realize that he may not wish to discuss his Zodiac suspect, but I think it would be interesting to pick his brain. And P.S. Your nephew Nettie the Younger has finally completed his cobbler internship. Nettie the Younger, amazing. Now, would I interview Sphere the Cube? Absolutely. He is a completely anonymous individual. I don't even know his real name. He has a Zodiac killer suspect named Robert Volvins, who is, well, let's just say somebody who has a connection to Moraga, California. And Sphere is the one who found out that the radian lines from Mount Diablo can go through Moraga, California, and they can go all the way to North Dakota. Like if you were to take the radian line, go southwest, it goes through Moraga, California. What the Zodiac said was put the radians on top of Mount Diablo, and it's going to concern inches along the radians. Well, one line goes through Moraga, California, and if you keep going northeast, it goes all the way to North Dakota. And in North Dakota, there was the murder of Laura Jean Dugan. And that fits into Sphere's theory. And I have an episode about that here called, Did the Zodiac Killer Murder Laura Jean Dugan? Another person who claims by his own admission to have made this type of discovery about the radians in North Dakota is James Freeman, who is the author of the Crooked River series. He has a Zodiac killer suspect named Henry Vestal Stone, and he believes that the killer was committing murders along the first radian line that goes up to Minot, North Dakota, and then there's also a southeast line that goes all the way to Norfolk, Virginia. Very, very intense geometric planes. Batman66 says, can you do an episode about the anthrax killer? I would love to. Batman66, I have about 4 episodes on the anthrax killer, and I think it's one of the absolutely most fascinating stories Firstly, the episode that I did called The Unabomber versus the Anthrax Killer was one of my favorite episodes to do. It's actually called The Unabomber versus the Anthrax Killer Psychological Breakdown, because that was when I did the Versus series, and I compared and contrasted two different criminals. There are so many similarities between the Anthrax Killer and Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Now, the Anthrax Killer has been identified in the minds of some. They think that he was a microbiologist who worked in Maryland named Bruce Ivans. But this is at one time when the conspiracy theories run wild. And people are like, now these aren't just conspiracy theories. Because Bruce Ivans has been accused of being the anthrax killer. However, you can even just find this stuff from mainstream sources, which like to throw water on the conspiracy theories. And they're like, hey, he shouldn't have had access to the type of anthrax that was used in the letters. Yes, he's a microbiologist. Yes, he worked at Fort Detrick. Yes, he had access to anthrax, but it was not the same type of anthrax that was used in the letters. You can talk about anything else that you want. If there was no possible way that he could have obtained the anthrax that was used in the anthrax letters, maybe he's not the guy. Unless there's something else that's going to happen. But yes, I am very fascinated by that story. 42 Lehman says, I think an outside chance of finding Z would be searching in letters to the editor for similar verbiage and sayings. Believe Tom Voigt had this idea at one point. Oh yes, Tom Voigt did, and so did Mike Rodelli. If I understand, that's how Mike Rodelli began to look for his Zodiac killer suspect, Shel Cavalli, when the Riverside letters were mailed in 1967. The ones that say Bates had to die, there will be more. Those were mailed 6 months after the murder of Sherry Jo Bates. So Mike Rodelli noticed that the Lake Herman Road murders occurred on December 20th of 1968, and the Blue Rock Springs shooting didn't happen until July 4th of 1969. That's roughly a 7-month gap. So he was like, well, let's see if somebody wrote a letter to the editor under their own name 6 months after the Lake Herman Road murders and a month before the Blue Rock Springs shooting. And he searched through letters to the editor, and he found one from Shel Cavalli, perhaps the wealthiest Zodiac killer suspect in the world. But yes, I do think that would be an interesting way to try and track down somebody. Batman66 says, see the Eternal Golden Braid. Oh, I'm not familiar with the Eternal Golden Braid, Batman66. If you want to share anything else in the chat, go for it. And this episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning is going to be winding down. If anybody has any final questions or comments, you can put them down below. And no matter what, I'll be with you guys tomorrow for an episode about D.B. Cooper. And I release shorts Monday through Friday here on YouTube, as well as on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. They come out, Blackbox Ned 88 on TikTok and Instagram. So those have mostly been focused on Jack the Ripper lately, because last year I had the opportunity to read a handful of Jack the Ripper books, and I wanted to try and make short book reviews, and those have been coming out Monday through Friday here on BBO War. So if anybody has any final questions, they can put them in the chat. Batman66 says they believe the Anthrax Killer referenced this, the Eternal Golden Braid. Yeah, I'd love to do one of these streams about the Anthrax Killer. Now, maybe that can be worked into Zodiac Monday, because there are a lot of Zodiac Killer, Anthrax Killer parallels. It's even called the Zodi-Anthrax Connection. And somebody, I guess I can say his name, Tyler, first name anyway, he approached me about it when he was like, he's not saying that the Zodiac Killer and the Anthrax Killer were the same person. He was saying that there is this type of similarities. He was exploring it as a mental exercise because he found certain things with Bruce Ivans, the alleged Anthrax Killer, line up with the Zodiac, and even the Californian connection and so on. And it's very hard to pinpoint this stuff, but that's what he was pointing out. Well, all right, everybody. Thank you so much for spending your morning with me here on Thursday. Thank you for this episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And you guys all have a wonderful day. Starry and I are going to chill for a second. And I'm back on the decaffeinated coffee right now. Like I told you, it's cold coffee, not hot coffee. I'm just really missed the stuff, being a regular coffee drinker for 21 years and such. Oh, I'm 36 years old. I've been drinking coffee way more than that. It's like, my birthday is coming up. Total side note. And I was like, I'm about to turn 31 years old. That's what I was thinking. Then I'm like, I am not turning 31 years old. That was 5 years ago. Like, this happens. All of you guys who are older than I am, I was warned about this by people who are older than me. They're going to you're going to forget how old you are. I'm like, how could you ever forget how old you are? All the time. 8 or 9 times a year, I forget how old I am. Happy birthday to me. All right, everybody, you all have a wonderful morning. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you tomorrow, and everybody take care.